He was running for his life. He had 4 or 5 men with him. He had a transit scope, a sidearm, and a memory of every rail grade he had ever surveyed, and as he came down the long, unbroken spine of that ridge, with his lungs burning and his guide pleading for him to move, he stopped. He stopped because he was an engineer, and he saw something no military map and no emigrant trail had ever recorded. What do you do when the thing you are running from leads you to the thing you have been searching for your entire life? When the same year that nearly kills you is the same year that makes you? This is the story of Grenville Mellen Dodge, the engineer who built the Union Pacific, and it is the story of what that road actually cost. Welcome back to Western Pioneer Archives. If you find these long-form histories of the men, women, and machines that shaped the American West worth your time, please subscribe, and please drop a comment with the answer to this question. When you think of the Transcontinental Railroad, do you picture the spike, the train, or the men who walked the line first? Now, the story. The first thing to understand about Grenville Mellen Dodge is that he was not, in the deepest sense, a railroad man. He was a surveyor. The distinction matters. A railroad man thinks in cargo and capital, in stock prices and shipping rates, and the schedules of the eastern boardrooms. A surveyor thinks in slopes. He thinks in the angle at which a wheel will hold and the angle at which it will slip. He thinks in the rise of a hill measured in feet per mile, and in the difference between a 4-degree curve, which a locomotive can take in stride, and a 6-degree curve, which begins to punish the rails. He thinks in the language of the land itself, and every great act of his life, the battles he won, the spies he ran, the railroad he helped lay across half a continent. Every single one of those acts was, at its core, a surveyor's act, a reading of the ground, a measurement of what was possible. He was born on April 12, 1831, in the Putnamville section of Danvers, Massachusetts, to a father named Sylvanus Dodge and a mother named Julia Teresa Phillips. The Phillips line went back to the Reverend George Phillips, who had stepped off a boat onto the shore of Massachusetts Bay in 1630 and helped settle the town of Watertown. So the Dodge boy was not a man without roots. He was a man with 2 centuries of New England under his feet. But his father was restless, the way many men were restless in the 1830s, and the family moved often during Grenville's first 13 years as Sylvanus tried one occupation after another. In 1844, the wandering stopped. Sylvanus Dodge became postmaster of the South Danvers office and opened a bookstore, and the family finally settled into a life with corners and walls and predictable meal times. That same year, working at a neighboring farm, the 14-year-old Grenville met a young man named Frederick W. Lander. Lander would later become, in the words of one historian, one of the ablest surveyors of the exploration of the American West. But in 1844, he was simply the son of the farm owner, and he was running a railroad line. He took the boy with him. He put a transit in his hands. He showed him how to chain a distance and how to read a slope. And he saw, almost immediately, what the boy was. Lander encouraged him to attend his own alma mater, Norwich University, the military college in the Green Hills of Vermont. Dodge prepared for it by enrolling first at Durham Academy in New Hampshire. He graduated from Norwich in 1851 with a degree in civil engineering. He was 20 years old. He had a piece of paper that said he understood the mathematics of the earth, and the American Republic was about to need every man who could read it. He went west. He went to Peru, Illinois, and started working as a surveyor and an axeman for the Illinois Central Railroad. Then he switched to the Peoria division of the Chicago and Rock Island. The country was being unzipped by iron. The eastern states had been gridded with tracks since the 1830s, but now the rails were marching across the Mississippi, racing each other to be the first to bind a continent. There was no more important profession on the frontier in those years than the man with a transit. The surveyor went out first. The track followed. Dodge moved across the Mississippi to the Iowa side, to a Missouri river town called Council Bluffs, and he settled there. He would live there in one form or another for the rest of his life. On May 29, 1854, he married Ruth Ann Brown of Peru, Illinois. She was a steady woman, and the marriage would last 61 years and produce 3 daughters. By 1860, he was a partner in a banking firm called Baldwin & Dodge. He was on the Council Bluffs City Council, and he had spent nearly a decade reading every inch of ground between the Missouri River and the Pacific that a horse could carry him over. Now we have to talk about an afternoon on a hotel porch. In 1859, a tall, gangly lawyer from Illinois came through Council Bluffs to investigate a piece of property tied to a debt. The lawyer was Abraham Lincoln. He had been in Council Bluffs for some sort of land matter, and someone had told him that the local man to ask about railroads was a young engineer named Dodge. Lincoln found him on the steps of the Pacific House Hotel. He cornered him. He sat down on the steps with him, and for 2 solid hours, while the Iowa sun moved across the porch boards, he asked the engineer one question after another about where, exactly, the Great Pacific Railroad would have to be built. Dodge gave him a complete answer. He told him the Platte Valley. He told him the line had to follow the broad, shallow Platte River west across Nebraska, because the Platte sloped up gently, 6 feet to the mile, almost the perfect grade for a locomotive. He told him the line should start at Council Bluffs, on the east bank of the Missouri, where it could meet the rails of the eastern roads. He told him exactly which ridges had to be avoided and which valleys had to be followed. The lawyer listened, asked questions, and went on his way. 4 years later, that lawyer was the President of the United States. And the engineer he had cornered on a hotel porch was about to be summoned to Washington to repeat, for the record, every word he had said. The Platte Valley would be the route. Council Bluffs would be the eastern terminus. The whole shape of the Transcontinental Railroad, the largest engineering project the Republic had ever attempted, would track, almost exactly, what Grenville Dodge had told Abraham Lincoln on a porch in Iowa in 1859. But before any of that could happen, the country tore itself apart. When the Civil War began in April of 1861, Dodge was 30 years old, a husband, a father, a businessman, a surveyor. He was not a soldier. He had never been in combat. He had a Norwich military education, but Norwich was a small college, and its military instruction was largely theoretical. Yet, within weeks of the firing on Fort Sumter, the governor of Iowa, Samuel J. Kirkwood, had identified Dodge as one of the most resourceful men in the state and dispatched him to Washington, D.C. The mission was specific. Iowa needed muskets. The state had volunteers, but no rifles to put in their hands. Dodge went east, navigated the chaos of a War Department in its first month of war, and came back with 6,000 muskets for the Iowa Volunteers. That was not a soldier's act. That was a logistician's act. And the United States Army was about to discover that it needed logisticians at least as desperately as it needed soldiers. In July of 1861, Grenville Dodge was appointed colonel of the 4th Iowa Volunteer Infantry Regiment. He was a colonel of volunteers, leading raw farm boys who had never fired a rifle at another human being, and he was responsible for getting them trained, fed, paid, armed, and moved to wherever the Army needed them. He took to it. He had a methodical mind. He kept careful records. He understood that an army was a logistical organism long before it was a fighting one. And when he finally got the regiment into the field in the broken country of southwestern Missouri, he discovered something else about himself. He could not be intimidated. Near Rolla, Missouri, in those first weeks of active service, he was wounded in the left leg, when a pistol in his coat pocket discharged accidentally. A self-inflicted wound, the most embarrassing kind, the kind that ends some men's military careers. It did not end his. He healed, he went back, and by early 1862, he was commanding a brigade in the 1st Brigade, 4th Division of the Army of the Southwest, under a deliberate, careful brigadier general named Samuel R. Curtis. Curtis was leading roughly 10,000 Union soldiers south out of central Missouri into the rugged hills of northwestern Arkansas, chasing a Confederate force back into its own territory. Somewhere ahead of them, the Confederates were going to turn around and fight. The place they turned around was a low wooded ridge called Pea Ridge. It was March of 1862. The Confederates were under the command of Major General Earl Van Dorn, a Mississippi cavalryman with a reputation for boldness and a habit of moving faster than his supply trains could follow. He had been appointed overall commander of the Trans-Mississippi District specifically to settle a simmering personal feud between two of his subordinates, Sterling Price of Missouri and Benjamin McCulloch of Texas. He had managed to unite their forces into a single army of roughly 16,000 men. It included Price's Missouri State Guard, McCulloch's mixed force of Texan, Arkansas, and Louisianan cavalry and infantry, and a contingent of about 800 Native American troops, Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, under the command of a Confederate brigadier general named Albert Pike. By weight of men and guns, it was the most substantial Confederate force ever assembled west of the Mississippi. Van Dorn intended to destroy it. Not Curtis's army, his own. He decided to flank the Federal position. He had his men leave behind their tents, their cooking utensils, and most of their food, carrying only 3 days of rations, 40 rounds of ammunition, and a single blanket each. He ordered a forced march, in a freezing rain, around the Union right and into the Union rear. The plan was to come down on Curtis from the north, cutting his supply line to St. Louis and trapping him against the bluffs of Little Sugar Creek, where the Federal Army was dug in. It was a brilliant plan on paper. On the ground, it was a disaster waiting to happen. Van Dorn had no engineer corps, he had no supply train. His soldiers were exhausted, frozen, and hungry before the battle even began. And on the night of March 6th, 1862, while Van Dorn's army was making its long, miserable night march, a 30-year-old colonel from Iowa was out in front of him with axes. Curtis had given Dodge a small detachment and approval to obstruct the Bentonville detour, the very road Van Dorn was using. Dodge took his men out into the cold, in the dark, and they felled trees across the road between 12 Corner Church and Cross Timber Hollow. He knew, the way only an engineer can know, that every tree he dropped was an hour of delay for the Confederate column. Every hour was a man's worth of exhaustion. Every hour was ammunition for the Union artillery being moved into position. He was, in the quietest possible way, winning the battle before it began. Van Dorn's night march was so badly slowed by clearing Dodge's obstructions that by dawn on March 7th, only the head of Price's division had reached Cross Timber Hollow. McCulloch's entire division was still strung out far behind. The Confederate plan to concentrate at Elkhorn Tavern collapsed. Van Dorn was forced to split his attack, sending McCulloch's force around one side of Big Mountain and Price's around the other. The Confederate army was now divided into two halves, with no good way to communicate between them, and each half was about to run into a Union force that knew it was coming. The Battle of Pea Ridge, also known as the Battle of Elkhorn Tavern, exploded along two fronts on the morning of March 7th. On the Leetown front, on the western side of Big Mountain, McCulloch's division blundered into a Federal task force under Colonel Peter J. Osterhaus. The fighting there became one of the deadliest small engagements of the entire war for senior Confederate officers. McCulloch himself, riding forward to reconnoiter, was shot through the heart by an Illinois skirmisher. Brigadier General James M. McIntosh, taking command after a delay, was dropped dead with a bullet in him while leading a charge. By mid-afternoon, Confederate command on the Leetown side had collapsed. Colonel Louis Hebert, who had taken control of the left wing, blundered through a gap in the Federal lines and was captured along with his entire staff. Brigadier General Albert Pike, technically outside the chain of command, ended up leading what was left of McCulloch's force in a confused retreat back across the ridge. 3 Confederate generals lost in a single afternoon. McCulloch's division, the larger half of Van Dorn's army, was effectively destroyed as a fighting force before sundown on the first day. On the Elkhorn Tavern front, on the eastern side of Big Mountain, it was Dodge's fight. Colonel Eugene A. Carr's 4th Division, to which Dodge's brigade belonged, was rushed northeast up the Wire Road to meet Price's advance. Dodge had been briefly ordered to remain at Pratt's store, but he had taken the initiative, the way he would take initiative for the rest of his life, and moved up the road behind Carr. By mid-morning, the Federal line was forming along the edge of the plateau near Elkhorn Tavern. Price's Confederates were coming up out of Cross Timber Hollow, and Van Dorn was now in personal command of the assault. He had roughly 5,000 men. Carr had less than half that number. The fight went on all day. Carr was wounded 3 separate times, in the ankle, in the neck, and in the arm, and refused to leave the field. Dodge's brigade was placed on the right of the Federal line at a small piece of ground called Clemens Farm, and it was there that he met the Confederate assault with everything he had. The historical records in the dry military language of the official reports that Dodge's brigade put up a terrific fight. Around 4:30 in the afternoon, with Price's left wing finally emerging from Williams Hollow and outflanking the Federal position, Dodge's line at Clemens Farm collapsed. He was hit twice, wounded in the side and wounded in the hand. He kept his command. He kept fighting. He pulled his men back across roughly a quarter-mile of fields and woods through Confederate artillery fire and infantry pressure, and finally halted the Confederate drive at a place called Ruddock's Field, where his bloodied brigade joined what was left of Carr's division. At 6:30 p.m., as the early March darkness came down, Curtis launched a short counterattack and then recalled his men. The night was bitter cold. Both armies slept on the field, less than a quarter-mile apart in the dark. When the sun came up on March 8th, Van Dorn discovered that his ammunition train, ordered back to Camp Stevens the previous evening, was a 6-hour march away. He had been outflanking the Union Army with no logistical tail. He had 2 divisions left on the field, one of them mauled, the other now leaderless, and his own artillery was about to run out of shells. The Federal artillery, by contrast, had been carefully positioned overnight by Franz Sigel onto a low knoll west of Elkhorn. 21 Union cannons opened up at first light. The Confederate batteries opposite them returned fire briefly, then went silent. Their ammunition was gone. Sigel's gunners then began firing into the woods at the base of Big Mountain, where the Confederate infantry had taken shelter, and the projectiles created what one historian later called a deadly combination of rock shrapnel and wood splinters. The Confederate infantry broke. Van Dorn realized he was beaten. He ordered a retreat down the Huntsville Road, leaving his wounded behind, abandoning his supply train, and sending what was left of his army into a sparsely settled country where they would have to live for a week on what little food they could take from the inhabitants. Pea Ridge was over. The Confederates had lost roughly 2,000 men. They never again seriously threatened the state of Missouri. Within weeks, Van Dorn's army would be transferred east of the Mississippi, and Arkansas would be left virtually defenseless. The Federal forces had lost 203 men killed, 980 wounded, and 201 missing, a total of 1,384 casualties. Carr's 4th Division, which included Dodge's brigade, had lost 682 of them, almost all on the first day. Dodge survived. The wounds in his side and hand healed. His brigade had taken some of the heaviest punishment in the battle, and Curtis, in his official report, singled Dodge out for praise. Within weeks, Grenville Dodge was promoted to Brigadier General of Volunteers. He was 30 years old. He had fought his first major battle, taken 2 wounds, held a defensive position against a numerically superior enemy, and emerged with the personal admiration of his commanding general. He would never command another infantry brigade in line of battle. He had something else to do. He was sent to Corinth, Mississippi, in the late spring of 1862 to take command of a district. And it was at Corinth that the second great career of Grenville Dodge, the one for which the Confederacy would never forgive him, the one that would alter the course of the war in the Western Theater, began in a small room with a map on the wall. He became a spymaster. The man who taught him, by negative example, was John C. Fremont. Earlier in the war, Fremont had sent Dodge's cavalry regiments on a series of useless raids near Rolla, Missouri, based on nothing but rumors. Dodge had watched men get killed because their commanding general was operating on bad information. He resolved that he would never do the same. When Fremont was relieved and Samuel Curtis took over, Dodge began to build, on his own initiative, an intelligence network. He started with what he called the Corps of Scouts, drawn from the 24th and 25th Missouri Infantry Regiments. These were men assigned to reconnaissance in their own neighborhoods. They knew the roads, the families, the rumors, the Unionists, the secessionists, the women who would talk and the women who would not. Most of them refused payment because they were Union loyalists. They provided much of the intelligence that allowed Curtis to win at Pea Ridge. After Pea Ridge, in his new command at Corinth, Dodge expanded the system. He went bigger. He went deeper. He went eventually all the way to Atlanta. What he built between 1862 and 1865 was perhaps the most accurate and comprehensive intelligence-gathering network in human history up to that time. It was funded in part by the proceeds of captured Confederate cotton, bales seized by Union troops and sold for cash, which Dodge used to pay agents and informants. The network ran more than 100 agents at its peak. It stretched from Atlanta and Dalton in Georgia, through Florence and Selma, and Decatur and Mobile in Alabama, through Chattanooga and Columbia in Tennessee, and across northern Mississippi. The agents reported up a chain to Dodge, to Major General Richard Oglesby, to Stephen Hurlbut in Memphis, and finally to Ulysses S. Grant. The process took about 10 days from the field to the commanding general's tent. The agents were a deliberately varied collection. Dodge used female spies who could move through Confederate territory in ways men could not. He used runaway slaves who knew the Southern landscape and had every reason to want the Union to win. He used Unionists living in Confederate territory, organized into the 1st Tennessee Cavalry and the 1st Alabama Cavalry. He used signals intelligence, tapping Confederate telegraph wires and reading the messages, and counterintelligence, enciphering all of his own dispatches so that Confederate operators could not read them back. He was, by the standards of his century, obsessively concerned with what later intelligence officers would call operational security. He corresponded by courier rather than by telegraph wherever possible. He trained his agents to avoid the great curse of human intelligence, exaggeration, by giving them concrete tests. To estimate the size of an enemy column, His agents were taught to measure the length of the column along the road and divide it by the known length of a man and a horse. They were taught not to guess. They were taught to count. And here was the part that mattered most. The identities of the agents in Dodge's network were so closely held that even Grant did not know them. When Major General Stephen Hurlbut, at one point, threatened to cut off funding for the operation unless Dodge turned over the names of his agents, Dodge refused. He took the matter to Grant. Grant backed him. Grant later wrote to Dodge, in 1863, words that any officer would have framed on his wall: "You have a much more important command than that of a division in the field." The men whose names Dodge protected so fiercely have never been identified. They lived, fought, gathered intelligence, sometimes died, and disappeared into history. Their identities remain a mystery to this day. The network's first great test came during the Vicksburg campaign. Grant was trying to take Vicksburg, the Confederate fortress on the Mississippi River that the Confederacy needed to hold in order to keep the Trans-Mississippi connected to the rest of its territory. Vicksburg sat on a high bluff above a hairpin bend in the river. It had been called impregnable. Grant had been trying to take it for the better part of a year, and he had been failing in increasingly creative ways. By May of 1863, he had crossed the Mississippi south of the city, cut himself off from his supply lines, and begun a campaign of rapid maneuver across the interior of Mississippi. He was facing two Confederate forces. One was inside Vicksburg under Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton. The other was a relief force under General Joseph E. Johnston, somewhere in the Mississippi countryside, trying to consolidate enough men to break the siege Grant was about to lay. Grant's problem was simple in concept and nearly impossible in execution. He had to know, with precision, where Johnston was, what he had, and where he was going. If he turned his army to fight Johnston, Pemberton would escape. If he committed to Pemberton without knowing where Johnston was, Johnston would hit him in the back. It was Dodge's network that told him. On May 16, 1863, intelligence indicated that Johnston was not in a position to interfere, that Grant could safely turn his forces away from the relief column and concentrate everything against Pemberton at Vicksburg. The information was so time-sensitive that Dodge, against his own iron rule of operational security, allowed his agents to report directly to Grant, rather than routing the intelligence up the long chain through Memphis. The decision worked. Grant attacked. Pemberton was caught. Within 6 weeks, on July 4, 1863, Vicksburg surrendered. The decision cost Dodge personally. One of his agents was captured. 2 more were killed. He never violated his communications protocols again. But the Mississippi River was open. The Confederacy was cut in half, and Ulysses S. Grant, the future commanding general of all Union armies, the future President of the United States, knew exactly to whom he owed the intelligence picture of the Vicksburg campaign. That same year, Abraham Lincoln summoned Dodge to Washington. Dodge thought he was being called before a court of inquiry. He had been, by the standards of 1863, dangerously aggressive in his recruitment of black soldiers into the United States colored troops. He had been doing it on his own initiative, in territory still officially part of the Confederacy, drawing freed and escaped slaves into uniformed federal service. He fully expected to be reprimanded. He arrived at the White House prepared to defend himself. Lincoln did not want to talk about black soldiers. Lincoln wanted to talk about a hotel porch in Council Bluffs 4 years earlier. He wanted to know, for the federal record, exactly where the Union Pacific Railroad should have its initial point on the Missouri River. He wanted Dodge, the surveyor, to tell him again what he had told him in 1859. Dodge told him again. The eastern terminus of the Great Pacific Railroad should be Council Bluffs, Iowa. The line should follow the Platte. On November 17, 1863, President Lincoln signed an executive order establishing Council Bluffs as the starting point of the Union Pacific Railroad. The order was based almost entirely on the engineer's testimony. 2 days later, Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address. The war for the existence of the United States was being fought in 2 registers simultaneously, on the battlefield and on the drafting table. Dodge went back to the war. He was given command of a division in the Army of the Tennessee under Grant and Sherman. His troops worked at the rough, urgent, decisive task that the modern military calls combat engineering. They rebuilt the railroads, the bridges, and the telegraph lines that the Confederates ripped up faster than the Union could lay them. He developed a technique of building 2-story blockhouses near every bridge to repel Confederate guerrillas who had been making a sport of burning the trestles down. The trains kept running. The supplies kept moving. Sherman, who would later attempt to march an army of 60,000 men through the heart of Georgia, would never have been able to do it without the men behind him keeping his line of communication alive. In June of 1864, Dodge was promoted to Major General. He was given command of the 16th Corps in Sherman's Army Group, advancing on Atlanta. On July 22, 1864, the 16th Corps was supposed to be in reserve at what would become known as the Battle of Atlanta, but Confederate General John B. Hood had launched a massive flanking attack against Sherman's left, and by sheer geographical accident, Dodge's Reserve Corps was positioned directly across the path of Hood's flank march. The 16th Corps did not fall back. It pivoted into the attack. Dodge rode forward and personally led Thomas W. Sweeney's division into the fight. The action was so unorthodox, a corps commander leading a division on the field, that it outraged Sweeney so much that after the battle was over, the one-armed division commander got into a fist fight with Dodge and with his fellow division commander, John W. Fuller. Sweeney was eventually court-martialed for it. Dodge kept his corps. He led it on, days later, into the Battle of Ezra Church. And then, on a quiet afternoon during the siege of Atlanta, while peering through a small observation hole in the Union breastworks, Dodge was shot in the head. A Confederate sharpshooter had spotted him. The shot caught him in the forehead, raking across the skull. It should have killed him. It did not. The wound was severe, and it ended his service in the Eastern Theater of the war. He was sent home to recover. While he was recovering in the closing months of the conflict, Sherman finished his march to the sea, Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the Civil War as a fighting conflict ended. But the country still needed soldiers, and the country still needed Dodge. In the summer of 1865, even as the great Union armies were being demobilized and the soldiers were going home to their farms, Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors had been raiding the Bozeman Trail and the overland mail routes that ran from the Missouri River out to the Pacific. The reasons were not mysterious. The buffalo, the country, and the way of life of the Plains nations were being pressed on every side by an industrial society that wanted the land for grass, for gold, for telegraph poles, and most of all for the steel rails that were about to come. The raids were the response. The federal government's response, in turn, was to expand the Department of the Missouri to include the departments of Kansas, Nebraska, and Utah, and to give command of it to Major General Grenville Mellen Dodge. He had recovered more or less from the head wound. He was now the senior federal commander for the entire Central Plains, and he ordered a punitive campaign against the tribes raiding along the Powder River. This is the part of his story that has to be told honestly. The Powder River Expedition, as it came to be called, was an act of military force against people whose treaties were being broken and whose lands were being invaded. Field command of the expedition was given to Brigadier General Patrick Edward Connor, who had commanded the District of Utah. Connor's column inflicted a decisive defeat on the Arapaho at the Battle of the Tongue River in August of 1865, in which a village was destroyed and an unknown number of Arapaho, including women and children, were killed. The expedition as a whole was militarily inconclusive. It did not pacify the region. If anything, it deepened the resolve of the northern tribes to defend the Powder River country. And within a year, the violence would escalate into what history calls Red Cloud's War, a sustained military campaign by the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho that would eventually force the United States to abandon a string of forts along the Bozeman Trail and acknowledge, however briefly, the sovereignty of the Lakota in the Black Hills. Dodge was not on the front line of the Powder River expedition. He was its commanding officer. He gave the orders. The orders did not produce a tactical victory, but they did produce a strategic transformation. The reason he had ordered the campaign, the reason any of this was happening, was not really about the raids. It was about the railroad. Dodge knew, the way a surveyor knows, that no transcontinental railroad could be built across country in which armed native nations could attack survey parties at will. He needed the corridor. He needed it cleared, or at least intimidated, and he was prepared to use the United States Army to do it. The campaigns against the Plains tribes in 1865 and 1866 were, in their deepest sense, advance work for the railroad. The road came west. The treaties broke. The villages were attacked. The corridor opened. The rails went down. The indigenous people he fought called him, according to the historical record, Long Eye, for the transit scope he carried with him on horseback and used to watch their movements from a distance. He used the same instrument he had used at Pea Ridge to drop trees on the Bentonville detour. He used the same instrument he would use 2 years later to lay out the highest railroad grade in the world. To him, the transit was always the same tool. To the people on the other end of it, it was something else. And then, in September of 1865, somewhere on the long ridge that runs east from the Laramie Range down to the high plains of southeastern Wyoming, came the moment that would change his life. He had been operating with a small scouting party in country he had been told nothing about by any soldier who had been there before. He was somewhere south of Crow Creek, in territory that the maps of the day described, accurately enough, as the Black Hills, though this was the southern Black Hills, what later mapmakers would call the Laramie Mountains, not the higher Black Hills of South Dakota that the Lakota called Paha Sapa. He had a guide with him. He had 4 or 5 men, and he had, somewhere on the ridge behind him, a war party that had picked up his trail and was closing in. The party dismounted. They began walking east, leading their horses, trying to get down off the ridge and back to the main body of his command before the war party reached them. They were not going to fight. They were going to run. But Dodge was an engineer, and as he walked the long spine of the ridge, with his guide pleading with him to move faster, with his lungs burning in the thin air, he began to notice the slope. The ridge was descending, not in steps, not in cliffs. It was descending in a single, continuous, almost perfectly graded slope, leading down to the plains below. The way a railroad grade descends. He stopped. He pulled out a notebook. He made a mark. He turned to his guide and said the words that would, half a century later, be carved into the legend of the Transcontinental Railroad. "If we can save our scalps, I believe we have found the crossing of the Black Hills." They saved their scalps. They got down to the plains, and Dodge marked the place with a lone tree so that he could find it again. The lone tree stood at the eastern end of what railroad men would later call the Gangplank, a narrow descending finger of ridge that connected the high plains more than 6,000 feet up to the spine of the Laramie Range. It was the one place in nearly 1,000 miles of mountains where a steam locomotive, climbing in a steady, gentle 2% grade, could mount the Rockies without having to climb a wall. The Gangplank was, in a sense, a geological accident. It was a piece of unbroken slope that thousands of years of erosion had failed to chew up. It was the doorway through which the Transcontinental Railroad was going to walk. There is a historical wrinkle here that honesty demands we address. A British-born civil engineer working for the Union Pacific named James A. Evans had surveyed Sherman Summit itself, the high point at the top of the Laramie Range just west of where Dodge's lone tree stood, in approximately 1864, a year before Dodge's run for his scalp. The pass at the summit was, in fact, originally called Evans Pass, and the town of Evanston, Wyoming, on the line further west, is named for him. What Dodge found in September of 1865 was not the summit. It was the approach. He found the Gangplank, the long, unbroken eastern ramp up to the summit, and it was that approach that made the route economically practical. Historians have argued ever since about how much credit Dodge deserves for the discovery. He himself, in his 1910 memoir, was not modest about it. The historian Walter Farnham has called Dodge's account fanciful. But this much is not in dispute. Dodge chose the route, Dodge defended it, and Dodge built it. The Union Pacific tracks, when they came west out of Cheyenne in 1867 and 1868, climbed the very ridge he had run down in September of 1865. In March of 1866, Grenville Dodge resigned his commission in the United States Army. He was 34 years old. He had fought through 4 years of the bloodiest war in the history of the Republic. He had been wounded 4 separate times: in the leg, in the side, in the hand, and in the head. He had built and run an intelligence network whose agents have never been identified. He had commanded a corps in the Atlanta campaign and a department on the Great Plains. He was, by any reasonable measure, finished with the Army. There was a different campaign waiting for him now. On May 1st, 1866, he was given leave from the service, and he went immediately to work for the Union Pacific Railroad as chief engineer. The appointment came with the personal endorsement of 2 of the most powerful men in America, Ulysses S. Grant, now commanding general of the United States Army, and William Tecumseh Sherman, who would succeed Grant in that role in 1869. Both men had served alongside Dodge in the Western Theater. Both men understood, in a way that no Eastern financier could, exactly what the country had just hired. The country had hired the man who had told Lincoln where to put the railroad in 1859. But before any of that, we need to talk about how the contract actually worked, because the story that gets told in textbooks, that Thomas C. Durant, the great financier of the Union Pacific, hired Dodge directly, is a simplification. What actually happened was more interesting and more revealing of how the entire transcontinental enterprise was actually structured. The Union Pacific Railroad had been chartered by an act of Congress in 1862, signed into law by Abraham Lincoln on July 1st of that year. The Pacific Railway Act authorized 2 private companies, the Central Pacific, building east from Sacramento, and the Union Pacific, building west from Council Bluffs, to construct a continuous railroad line all the way across the United States. To finance it, the federal government would issue 30-year bonds at 6% interest, paid per mile of track laid. The rates were tiered: $16,000 per mile on level grade, $32,000 per mile in the foothills, $48,000 per mile in the mountains. The companies would also receive massive land grants, alternate sections, 10 miles deep on either side of the track in a checkerboard pattern, for a total of more than 130 million acres of federal land transferred to the railroads. The total acreage granted by federal and state governments combined was, eventually, larger than the entire state of Texas. The act, as it was written, contained almost no provisions for oversight. The financiers running the railroads quickly discovered something obvious. There was no money in operating a railroad across an empty continent. There was money in building one, so they would form independent construction companies, owned by themselves, and the railroad would pay the construction company at inflated prices, and the difference would be pocketed. In the West, the Central Pacific's Big Four, Leland Stanford, Collis Huntington, Mark Hopkins, and Charles Crocker, set up a company they called, with admirable simplicity, the Contract and Finance Company. In the East, the Union Pacific's man, Dr. Thomas Clark Durant, set up a company with a fancier name. He called it Crédit Mobilier of America. It would, in time, become the most famous corporate scandal in 19th century American history. Durant was not the president of the Union Pacific. He was nominally only a vice president. He had cycled a series of respected men, like John Adams Dix, through the presidency to give the company an air of legitimacy. But Durant was the real power. He had been manipulating market prices on Union Pacific-related stocks since the beginning of the project, spreading rumors about which feeder railroads were going to be connected to the main line, buying low and selling high. By one estimate, his stock manipulations alone, entirely separate from the construction contracts, produced more than $5 million in profits for him and his cohorts. The actual construction contract for the first 250 miles of the Union Pacific was held by a man named Herbert M. Hub Hoxie, a former Lincoln political appointee. Hoxie assigned the contract to Durant. It was Hoxie who hired Grenville Dodge to do the engineering. Durant, who was about to be exposed for manipulating the route to suit his land holdings, would come into vicious conflict with both men. Dodge agreed to the appointment only on one condition. Durant had to promise him complete control over the engineering decisions, over where exactly the railroad would go. Durant promised it. Durant's promise was a lie. Almost immediately, Durant tried to impose on Dodge a man named Silas Seymour, whom he installed as a consulting engineer. Seymour's job was not to consult. His job was to spy on Dodge and to second-guess his survey decisions whenever those decisions failed to maximize Durant's profits. Dodge called Seymour, on the record, the worst sneak I think I ever met. When Dodge ignored Seymour's interference, Durant grew furious, threatened to dismiss Dodge, and at various points attempted to force him to resign. The two men, the engineer and the financier, would be at war with each other for the entire duration of the project. Meanwhile, the railroad itself had to be built. The first chief engineer of the Union Pacific had been a careful man named Peter A. Day. Day was the engineer who had taught Dodge much of what he knew about railroad surveying back in the 1850s on the Mississippi and Missouri Railroad. By 1865, Day had become chief engineer of the Union Pacific and had run preliminary surveys west of Council Bluffs. But Day had a quality that Durant could not tolerate. He was honest. When Durant ordered survey lines that took the railroad on long, unnecessary oxbow detours through territory that Durant owned, detours designed entirely to inflate the mileage on which the federal subsidies were paid, Day refused. At the end of 1865, after a particularly ugly dispute about routing west of Omaha, Peter Day resigned. He went back to a quiet engineering career in Iowa. He died many decades later, having never made a fortune. He is, in the history of the Transcontinental Railroad, one of its great and forgotten honest men. Durant needed a chief engineer. He needed, more specifically, a chief engineer who could handle the technical work without being so honest that the entire Crédit Mobilier scheme would collapse. He turned to his former employee from the Mississippi and Missouri days. He turned to Dodge. Construction had actually begun west of Omaha on July 10, 1865, under Day, but progress was slow. By December of 1865, only 40 miles of track had been completed, reaching the town of Fremont, Nebraska. The Union Pacific had also hired a former Union general named John Stephen Casement, known to everyone as Jack, and his brother Daniel as the construction contractors. Jack Casement was a small, compact, ferociously profane man who had commanded a brigade at Gettysburg. He was the one who actually drove the construction. While Dodge laid out the route and dealt with Durant's interference, Casement ran the railhead. What Casement built, as the railroad moved west across Nebraska in 1866 and 1867, was less like a construction project and more like an army on the move. He equipped a string of railroad cars to serve as portable bunkhouses for the workers. He added a galley car to cook the meals. He provided for a herd of cattle to be driven along with the railhead, so that the men would have fresh beef. He hired buffalo hunters to bring in additional meat from the herds that still covered the plains in those years. The whole operation rolled west on the rails it was laying, a self-contained city of labor that could put down a mile of track in a day under good conditions, sometimes more. The men who laid the track were, by and large, veterans of the Civil War. Some had worn Union blue, some had worn Confederate gray. They had come west looking for work, and the Union Pacific paid wages in cash. Many were Irish immigrants who had fought in the war as soldiers and now picked up rails and ties for $35 a month and 3 meals a day. Some were freed black men who had served in the United States colored troops. They worked 12-hour days under the watchful eye of Casement and his brother, and at night they slept stacked in bunks in the railroad cars, 8 or 10 to a car. The food was decent. The pay came when promised, at least most of the time. The work was brutal. The country was beginning to learn about the Hell on Wheels towns. The Hell on Wheels was a name given to the temporary settlements that sprang up at every railhead. They were made mostly of canvas, tents nailed to wooden frames, and they would appear in a matter of days as the railhead approached, flourish for a few weeks or a few months while the work was nearby, and then vanish almost overnight when the rails moved on. Julesburg, North Platte, Cheyenne, Laramie, Benton, Bear River City. Each of them had the same population: saloons, brothels, gambling houses, a few merchants selling tools and clothing, a sheriff if one could be hired, and a graveyard that filled up faster than the merchants could keep stock. The men who worked the railhead drank, gambled, fought, and occasionally killed each other in those towns. The towns existed to take their pay before they could send it home. Most of them did not last. Cheyenne did. Laramie did. The rest are dust. The construction proceeded west across the Platte Valley through 1866, the year Dodge took over as chief engineer in the late summer and fall, at a rate that astonished even the engineers who had laid out the route. The valley sloped up at 6 feet to the mile, almost no grade at all by railroad standards. The hard work was not the grading. The hard work was the bridges. Every creek had to be spanned. The North Platte alone required a bridge, 2,600 feet long, resting on piles driven by steam-powered pile drivers. The Loup River required another 1,500-foot bridge. By December of 1866, the rails had reached North Platte, Nebraska, about 240 miles of track laid in a single year. It was, at the time, the fastest railroad construction the United States had ever seen. It was about to get faster, In 1867, Grenville Dodge did something that almost nobody believed a working chief engineer could do at the same time. He got himself elected to Congress. In the Republican nominating convention for Iowa's 5th Congressional District, he defeated the incumbent Republican, John A. Casson. In the general election, he defeated the former Union General James M. Tuttle. He took his seat in the 40th United States Congress on March 4, 1867. He would serve a single term, ending March 3, 1869, and he would do his best to also run a 1,000-mile-long railroad construction site during the same period. He did not, in any meaningful sense, succeed at being a congressman. He spent most of his time in Washington lobbying on behalf of the Union Pacific. He pushed legislation favorable to the railroad. He was, in effect, a paid agent of the company sitting in the House of Representatives, and he made no real attempt to hide it. He drew heavy criticism for neglecting his official duties to survey Wyoming territory. He drew equally heavy criticism from Durant for being absent from the construction site. He was being attacked from both ends of the country for the same reason, that he could not be in two places at once. He did not seek re-election after one term. The political work, like everything else he did, came down to one thing. He was protecting the railroad. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1867, the railroad reached the high plains of what would become Wyoming. Dodge himself laid out the site of a new city. He picked a spot at an elevation of just over 6,000 feet, where the rising grade out of the South Platte Valley met the foothills of the Laramie Range. He called the town Cheyenne. The first stake went into the ground in July of 1867. Within weeks, the canvas tents began to go up. Within months, the population was in the thousands. Cheyenne would become a railroad town in the truest sense, equipped with extensive yards, maintenance facilities, and a major Union Pacific presence. And it would, in time, become the capital of the state of Wyoming. Dodge had founded a state capital. He had done it almost as a side effect of doing his job. But while the rails climbed toward the Gangplank in the summer and fall of 1867, the work was not unopposed. The Plains tribes, the Sioux, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, understood with a clarity that the white world of 1867 was slow to grasp exactly what was happening to them. The railroad was not just a faster way to move freight. The railroad was the end of the buffalo. The railroad was the end of the open range. The railroad was the end of their nations, as the United States had been signing treaties with them. They began to fight it, not in pitched battles. They did not have the men or the supplies for pitched battles against a federal army backed by industrial production, but in raids. They raided survey parties. They raided supply trains. They tore up sections of track, attacked telegraph poles, drove off horses, killed isolated work crews. The historical records, in dry military prose, that the small survey parties who scouted ahead to locate the roadbed were sometimes attacked and killed by raiding Native Americans. The United States Army responded with cavalry patrols. The patrols grew larger as the resistance grew more determined. Cavalry escorts began to accompany the survey parties wherever they went. Forts were built along the route, at Sidney, at Sanders, at Bridger. The corridor was, in effect, militarized for its entire length from the Missouri River to the Great Salt Lake. The railroad did not advance through a peaceful continent. It advanced behind the United States Army, and the Army advanced over a population that was being deliberately broken. The grimmest single moment of that resistance came in August of 1867 at a place called Plum Creek in Nebraska, where a Cheyenne war party led by a warrior named Turkey Leg pulled up a section of track and then ambushed a Union Pacific work train that derailed at the gap. Several workers were killed, It was the only successful train derailment by native warriors in the entire history of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, but it was a small fragment of a much larger picture. The picture was a continent being made over by force, and Dodge was, in his quiet, technical, methodical way, one of the principal authors of that force. While the Union Pacific climbed the high plains toward the Gangplank, the Central Pacific was waging a different kind of war, 2,000 miles to the west, against the granite of the Sierra Nevada. The Central Pacific had been chartered by the same act of Congress that had created the Union Pacific. The Big Four, Stanford, Huntington, Hopkins, and Crocker, had broken ground in Sacramento on January 8, 1863, almost 3 full years before the first Union Pacific Rail went down. By 1867, they were deep in the most brutal engineering work of the entire project, blasting 15 tunnels through the granite spine of the Sierra Nevada, the longest of them, the Summit Tunnel near Donner Pass, at 1,660 feet through solid rock. They could not get the white workers to do the job. Most California laborers preferred to work in the mines or in agriculture. The Central Pacific, desperate for manpower, experimented with hiring Chinese laborers, many of them recent emigrants from the Pearl River Delta of Guangdong Province, refugees from the catastrophic violence of the Taiping Rebellion and the Punti Hakka clan wars. The Chinese laborers proved themselves, and the Central Pacific began recruiting more. Eventually, by the height of construction, more than 10,000 Chinese men were on the line. They were paid roughly the same as white workers, about $31 per month at first, raised to $35 after a strike in 1867, but they were given lodging and preferred to cook their own meals. They did almost all of the heaviest manual labor. They drilled the granite of the Sierra by hand, holding rock drills against the tunnel face, while other workers swung 18-pound sledgehammers. They handled the nitroglycerin, the new, unstable, freshly invented explosive, that killed an unknown number of them in tunnel accidents. They worked through Sierra winters in which snowslides and avalanches buried entire work camps. They have no graves with names on them. The Central Pacific kept no comprehensive records of its Chinese dead. They are, in the polite phrase of historians, the silent spikes of the Iron Road. They built the western half of the railroad that the Union Pacific was racing to meet, and most of them died in obscurity. Both railroads were being paid by the mile. Both were heavily incentivized to lay as much track as possible, as quickly as possible. By 1867, it was clear that the two roads were going to meet somewhere in the west, but exactly where was not yet determined. The companies were each building as fast as they could, hoping to control as much of the eventual line as possible and pocket as much of the federal subsidy as possible. The lack of federal oversight, as one later historian would put it dryly, provided both companies with incentives to continue building their railroads past one another. For a brief period, the two companies were actually grading parallel routes through northern Utah, overlapping construction that produced no useful track, but did produce 2 sets of federal payments. It was financial absurdity. It was, also, the cost of doing what the United States had decided to do. In December of 1867, the Union Pacific reached Cheyenne. 270 miles of new track had been laid that year. The grade had reached a town of canvas and lumber that already had a population of several thousand and a reputation as the worst hell on wheels of the entire line. The Union Pacific paused at Cheyenne for the winter, gathering supplies, surveying ahead, and preparing for what everyone knew was coming next: the assault on the Laramie Range. In the spring of 1868, the rails began to climb. The route Dodge had chosen ran west out of Cheyenne. up the long gangplank that he had identified in his run from the war party in September of 1865. The rails ascended in a steady, gentle grade, climbing approximately 3,200 feet in the 220 miles from North Platte, an average of 15 feet per mile, less than 1/3 of 1%. It was a remarkable piece of routing. It was the reason the entire central route worked. By April 15, 1868, the Union Pacific tracks had reached Sherman's Summit at an elevation of 8,242 feet. It was, at completion, the highest point of any railroad anywhere in the world. Dodge had named the summit after his old friend William Tecumseh Sherman. About 4 miles beyond the summit, the railroad had to cross a deep ravine called Dale Creek Canyon. The Dale Creek Bridge, 650 feet long and 125 feet above the creek bottom, was built of timbers pre-cut in Chicago and shipped west on the very rails the bridge was meant to support. It was so spindly that the initial speed limit across it was 4 miles per hour. The bridge swayed in the wind. Travelers wrote home about how it felt to cross it, but it held. Beyond Dale Creek, the railroad descended onto the Laramie Plains and then began the long push west across what would become the state of Wyoming. By the end of 1868, the Union Pacific had laid almost 360 more miles, reaching Evanston, near the present-day border of Wyoming and Utah, and crossing the Green River, the last major river before the Wasatch Range. The construction had become a kind of machine. Casement's brothers managed the railhead. Dodge laid out the route and managed the political fights. Durant and Seymour interfered. Workers laid rail at rates that, on good days, exceeded a mile a day. But the closer they got to Utah, the more the political fight with Durant intensified, because they were now approaching the point where the line of the Union Pacific was going to meet the line of the Central Pacific. And the location of that meeting was going to determine which company collected federal subsidies for the disputed miles. This is where, in the summer of 1868, the confrontation came. The work itself, in those years between the founding of Cheyenne and the meeting at Promontory, deserves a closer look. Because the daily reality of building the Union Pacific was a kind of moving industrial city the like of which had never existed before in American history. The track-laying gang itself was a precise, choreographed operation. A flat car loaded with iron rails would be pushed by hand to the very end of the completed track. 2 gangs of 5 men each would seize the front rail on either side, slide it off the car, carry it forward, drop it onto the prepared ties, and hold it in position while a gauge man measured the distance between the 2 parallel rails. Exactly 4 feet and 8.5 inches, the new federal standard gauge. Behind them came the spikers, 3 to a rail, swinging mauls in a steady rhythm. Behind them came the bolters, fastening the fish plates that joined one length of rail to the next. The whole process, repeated thousands of times a day, produced what Casement's crews could often hit as a working pace: a length of new track every 30 seconds, 2.5 miles in a typical working day on flat ground, 4 miles in a hard push, 10 miles on the day in late April of 1869 when the Central Pacific crews would set their record that has never been beaten. The rails themselves weighed 56 or 66 pounds per yard. They were iron, not steel. The Bessemer steel-making process was new and not yet trusted for heavy rail. They had to be hauled by ship to the eastern docks, loaded on flat cars, and brought forward over the very rails the new ones were extending. The supply chain stretched, in effect, all the way from the steel mills of Pennsylvania to the surveyor's notebook 100 miles ahead of the railhead. Cross ties came from local timber wherever possible: cottonwood from the Platte, pine from the Black Hills, fir from the Wasatch. But on the bare stretches of Nebraska prairie, where there was no usable timber at all, ties had to be shipped in. Telegraph poles came along with the rails. The telegraph line was strung on its own poles just to the south of the track by a separate crew. By the time a train could run on a stretch of track, the telegraph was already operational along it, and station agents in the new railroad towns could communicate up and down the line. The track-laying army was supplied daily with food, water, ties, rails, spikes, fish plates, nuts and bolts, track ballast, telegraph wire, firewood or coal for the locomotive boilers, and water for the steam engines themselves. Every wagon train of supplies was its own small logistical miracle. Casement's brother Daniel managed the supply side. Daniel was the unsung casement of the operation. While Jack was driving the workers at the railhead, Daniel was making sure the rails kept coming. Without him, the operation would have starved. The food was, by the standards of 19th century camp labor, surprisingly good. The herd of cattle that traveled with the railhead provided fresh beef. Hunters brought in elk, antelope, and buffalo from the surrounding country. Hardtack and bacon were standard. Coffee was unlimited. Whiskey was nominally forbidden in the camp, but available to anyone with cash in the next hell on wheels down the line. Men ate at long board tables in the dining car, 20 at a time, served in shifts. The food was hot. The work was, in spite of the food, brutally hard. 12 hours a day was standard. The summer days on the high plains were stifling. Temperatures over 100 degrees in the shade, no shade. The winter days, when work continued at all, were murderous. Temperatures well below zero, with the prairie wind cutting straight through clothing that had been designed for a milder climate. Men dropped from heat exhaustion in the summer and from frostbite in the winter. Men were crushed by falling rails. Men were killed when locomotives derailed at construction speeds, when bridges gave way under unfinished trestles, when premature explosions of black powder and nitroglycerin scattered them across the worksite. The Union Pacific never compiled a comprehensive casualty list. The historian Stephen Ambrose estimated, by tracing county death records along the line, that the construction killed somewhere between several hundred and over 1,000 men. The number is, in some sense, unknowable, and the work was done increasingly under the immediate threat of attack. The Plum Creek incident of August 1867 has already been mentioned. It was the most successful raid by native warriors against the railroad. A section of track lifted, a freight train derailed, several workers killed, but it was not isolated. Throughout 1867 and 1868, survey parties and grading crews working ahead of the rails came under attack at irregular intervals. The records of the Department of the Platte include incident reports of small parties of Cheyenne, Sioux, and Arapaho warriors striking work camps, running off horses, killing isolated workers caught away from cover, then disappearing back into country that the U.S. cavalry could not effectively patrol. The raids were never large enough to stop the work. They were large enough to make every man on the line aware that he was operating in a contested territory. The Union Pacific's response was militarization. Cavalry escorts accompanied every survey party west of Fort Kearny. Work crews dug into defensive positions at night. The grading camps were ringed with sentries. The workers were issued rifles. The railhead, in some sense, was a moving frontier fortification as much as it was a construction project. Dodge himself, when he was traveling along the line in 1867 and 1868, traveled with a small armed escort. The transit scope went out of its case. The cavalry escort fanned out. The chief engineer made his measurements. The cavalry escort tightened back up. The party moved on. There is a story, recounted in several memoirs by Union Pacific men, of a survey party in Wyoming in 1867 that lost its escort temporarily and ran into a Sioux war party. The survey party was overrun. The transit was broken. Several men were killed. The chief surveyor of the party, a man named Percy Brown, was mortally wounded. He died before the relief column reached him. His notebooks were recovered, in fragments, by the relief party. The information they contained went into the route survey. The line that the Union Pacific built that summer was, in part, laid out by a dead man. This was the daily reality behind the photograph at Promontory. The handshake between Dodge and Montague was the end of a process that had killed an unknown number of workers, displaced an unknown number of indigenous people, exhausted thousands of men, financed multiple personal fortunes, and rebuilt the geography of a continent. The handshake was real. The cost was also real. And the engineer in the dark coat to the right of the locomotive understood, in a way that almost nobody else in the photograph did, exactly what each of those things had been. In July of 1868, a small group of men met at a fort in southeastern Wyoming territory. Fort Sanders sat near the present-day city of Laramie, on the Laramie Plains, just west of the Dale Creek Bridge. The official purpose of the meeting was a routing inspection of the Union Pacific west of the Laramie Range. The actual purpose was to settle, once and for all, whether the chief engineer of the Union Pacific or the financier of the Union Pacific was going to control the route of the railroad. Around the table at Fort Sanders that summer were some of the most powerful men in the United States. Ulysses S. Grant was there. He was, at that moment, the commanding general of the United States Army. He was also, although he had not yet been elected, the Republican Party's nominee for the presidency. William Tecumseh Sherman was there, as was Major General Philip Sheridan. So was Thomas Durant. So was Silas Seymour, the consulting engineer Durant had planted as a spy. And so was Grenville Dodge. Durant had a list of complaints. He felt that Dodge had laid out the line in ways that were too expensive, that bypassed land Durant had personal financial interests in, and that ignored Seymour's recommendations. He wanted Grant, the future president, the most powerful military officer in the country, the man who would within a year be making decisions about further federal subsidies to the railroad, to side with him. He wanted Dodge fired. What happened next has been recorded in slightly different versions in different accounts, but the substance is consistent. Dodge stood his ground. He told Grant, in front of Durant, that if the financier was going to be allowed to dictate routing decisions to him, he would resign as chief engineer. He told Grant that he would not be a party to laying out a railroad based on Durant's land holdings rather than on the engineering merits of the line. He told Grant, in effect, that he was prepared to walk away from the largest engineering project in American history, rather than allow his survey decisions to be overridden by a financier. Grant listened. Grant had known Dodge since the Vicksburg campaign. He had read his intelligence reports. He had backed him against Hurlbut over the funding of his spy network. He had, in 1865, sent him out to the Powder River as department commander. He trusted him. Grant turned to Durant and told him, in substance, that the government expected the railroad to be built, that Dodge was the chief engineer, and that the chief engineer's decisions on routing were to be respected. Durant retreated. The route, west of Fort Sanders, would be Dodge's route. Seymour was, for practical purposes, sidelined. It was the most important political battle Dodge ever won. And it had been won in the end because he had a friend who was about to become president. In November of 1868, Grant was elected to the presidency. He would take office on March 4th, 1869. He would, by virtue of the timing, be in the White House when the last spike was driven. The race in the winter of 1868 to 69 was on. The Union Pacific had pushed across Wyoming. The Central Pacific had crossed Nevada and was driving east. Both companies were laying track at unprecedented rates. The Central Pacific employed a tactic of pre-grading the roadbed far ahead of the actual track-laying crew, sometimes using paddle steamers on the Green River to haul construction equipment forward. The Union Pacific hired Mormon work crews under contracts negotiated with Brigham Young himself, putting thousands of Latter-day Saints to work building the difficult line through Echo Canyon and the Weber River Canyon in northern Utah. Even Brigham Young, who had subscribed to Union Pacific stock and supplied much of the labor through Utah, would later have cause to regret the deal. Some Union Pacific officers refused to pay the full agreed-upon construction costs for the work through the Weber Canyon, claiming the railroad was poverty-stricken despite the millions of dollars that were at the same moment being extracted through Crédit Mobilier. The Mormon work crews would only secure partial payment through years of court actions. It was, as one historian noted, a remarkable claim of poverty from a company in which a parallel construction firm was paying enormous dividends to its insiders. That was the other story of the Union Pacific's final push. The Crédit Mobilier scandal had not yet broken in the press. That would happen in 1872 when a New York newspaper would expose the entire scheme. But it was running at full speed in the late 1860s. The construction company owned by Durant and his associates was paying inflated bills to Union Pacific contractors, and the difference was being distributed as dividends to Crédit Mobilier shareholders. Those shareholders included, by some accounts, members of Congress whom Durant had bribed with discounted Crédit Mobilier stock. The scandal, when it finally broke, would destroy Durant, end the political careers of several congressmen, and tarnish the reputation of Vice President Schuyler Colfax. It would also, eventually, touch Dodge himself. He had bought shares in Crédit Mobilier when he saw the money Durant was making. He had profited. When the congressional investigation began, he removed himself to Texas to avoid testifying. He did not stand in the dock, but he did not stand entirely clean either. The railroad, though, was still being built. By March 8, 1869, the Union Pacific tracks had reached Ogden, Utah. The Mormon work crews had cut, blasted, trestled, and bridged a remarkable mountain railroad down through Echo and Weber canyons, including a 757-foot tunnel through hard rock blasted with the still experimental new explosive of nitroglycerin. Some workers died building it. The construction kept moving. The Central Pacific, in the meantime, was rolling east across the Nevada desert at a rate the Union Pacific could not match on the flat ground. They had crossed the Sierra in 1868. The Summit Tunnel had finally been holed through with nitroglycerin in the late summer of 1867. And now they were on the open ground. On April 28, 1869, Charles Crocker's Central Pacific crews staged a track-laying demonstration that has never been matched. With 8 Irish track layers handling the rails and hundreds of Chinese workers tamping ballast, hauling ties, and driving spikes, they laid 10 miles and 56 feet of finished railroad in a single working day. They put up a sign by the track to commemorate the feat. The Union Pacific never beat it. By late April of 1869, the two roads were within sight of each other. The agreed-upon meeting point, negotiated by Collis Huntington of the Central Pacific and Grenville Dodge of the Union Pacific in Washington that April, after intense political fighting over the location, was a low, dry, treeless saddle of land in northern Utah called Promontory Summit. The Union Pacific had already, in fact, graded miles of roadbed west of Promontory, hoping to claim federal subsidies for the additional mileage. The Central Pacific had graded east of Promontory for the same reason. Some of those graded sections, useless, parallel, redundant, would remain visible from satellites a century and a half later. They are the geological signature of unregulated capitalism. On May 10, 1869, a small crowd gathered at Promontory Summit, Utah Territory. Two locomotives faced each other on the rails. The Central Pacific's Jupiter stood on one side. The Union Pacific's number 119 stood on the other. Between them was a final stretch of rail that had been laid that morning and a final tie of polished California laurel drilled with 4 holes ready to receive ceremonial spikes. Several spikes were tapped ceremonially into the laurel tie. The most famous of them was the Golden Last Spike, presented by David Hughes of San Francisco and engraved with the names of the railroad officers. Leland Stanford, president of the Central Pacific, was selected to drive it. He swung the silver hammer. He missed the spike entirely on his first attempt, hitting the rail instead. The story of his miss was kept out of most of the official accounts. The official accounts said the spike went in clean. A telegraph operator wired the single word "done" to the nation, and the news traveled by wire from Promontory to Washington to Chicago to New York to San Francisco, where bells rang and cannons fired, and thousands of Americans gathered in city squares to celebrate the day the continent had been bound together by iron. Andrew J. Russell, the Union Pacific's official photographer, set up his camera and took the photograph that has become the visual signature of the entire enterprise. The image is titled "East and West, Shaking Hands at Laying of Last Rail." It shows the two locomotives nose to nose, the men of both companies crowded on top of the engines and around the trackside. In the center of the photograph, in the foreground, 2 men in dark coats are shaking hands. One of them is Samuel S. Montague, chief engineer of the Central Pacific. The other one is Grenville M. Dodge. He was 38 years old. The railroad that he had told Lincoln about in 1859, the railroad whose eastern terminus had been chosen because of his testimony in 1863, the railroad whose central route he had laid out and defended against Durant, the railroad whose passage over the Rocky Mountains he had identified during a war party's pursuit in 1865, was complete. The Union Pacific had built 1,085 miles of new railroad from the Missouri River at Council Bluffs to Promontory Summit. The Central Pacific had built 690 miles from Sacramento to Promontory. Together, with the Western Pacific's later extension to the Oakland Wharf, the total length of the line was 1,911 miles of continuous track from the Eastern Rail Network to the shore of the Pacific. A trip that had once required 6 months by wagon, 25 days by stagecoach, or 6 weeks by ship around Cape Horn could now be made in 7 days. The cost of shipping freight from coast to coast dropped to roughly 1/10 of what it had been by stagecoach or wagon. The continent had been remapped by economic gravity. The Great American Desert was about to become the Great American Breadbasket, and the man in the middle of the photograph went back to work. In 1870, Dodge resigned as chief engineer of the Union Pacific. He was not finished with railroads, he was finished with Durant. By that year, the political situation inside the Union Pacific had shifted decisively. Grant was in the White House. Durant had been forced out of his operational role at the company. Dodge had been appointed head of the Union Pacific's Land Department in 1869, in addition to his role as chief engineer, and the period of internal warfare that had defined the construction era was, at last, over. But the kind of work he wanted to do, the kind of work he had spent his life doing, was not the work of running a finished railroad. It was the work of building new ones. There was also another offer on the table, President Grant offered him the cabinet position of Secretary of War. Dodge declined. The reasons he declined have been the subject of speculation ever since. He himself wrote later that he had no taste for a desk job. But the more honest answer was probably that he understood by the late 1860s that the great age of American railroad construction was about to enter its second and even more expansive phase. The Transcontinental line had proven that the continent could be crossed. Now, every state and territory in the West wanted a railroad of its own. The Texas and Pacific, the Missouri-Kansas-Texas, the Fort Worth and Denver City, the Denver Pacific, the Iowa Falls and Sioux City, the Cairo, Vincennes, and Chicago, the Galveston, Houston, and Henderson. There were lines being chartered, surveyed, financed, and built across nearly every degree of longitude west of the Mississippi. Dodge had a reputation. He had political connections that extended from the White House to the State House of every state he had ever passed through. He had access to capital. He had, more than any other living American, the ability to look at a piece of country and tell investors where a railroad could be made to pay. For the next 30 years, he did exactly that. The exact tally varies depending on how it is counted, but he was involved as chief engineer, president, surveyor, financier, or some combination of all four, in the construction of more than 60,000 miles of railroad. He built lines in Texas. He built lines in Colorado. He built lines into Cuba. He served at various points as president or chief engineer of dozens of railroad companies. He made a fortune. He moved his business operations to New York City to be closer to capital markets, though he always kept his home in Council Bluffs. He served as a delegate to the Republican National Conventions of 1868 and 1876. He also, in 1872 and 1873, faced the consequences of the choices he had made during the construction of the Union Pacific. The Crédit Mobilier scandal broke in September of 1872, in the middle of Grant's re-election campaign. A New York Sun reporter named Charles Dana published a story exposing the entire scheme: the inflated construction contracts, the dividends paid to Crédit Mobilier shareholders, the discounted stock distributed to influential members of Congress. A congressional investigation followed. Several members of Congress, including future President James A. Garfield and Vice President Schuyler Colfax, were implicated. Durant was destroyed. The Union Pacific itself was forced to restructure its debt to the federal government, and the company struggled financially for the rest of the 19th century. Dodge had bought shares in Crédit Mobilier. He had made a substantial profit on them. The historical record on his exact role is murky, in part because Dodge himself worked very hard to keep it murky. When the congressional investigators began calling witnesses, Dodge removed himself from Washington, traveled to Texas, where he had ongoing railroad business, and made himself unavailable for testimony. He did not appear before the committee. He did not respond to the subpoenas. He went on, in effect, an extended business trip until the investigation concluded. It was the great moral compromise of his career. He had spent 4 years fighting Durant over the routing of the railroad. He had risked his job, taken his case to Grant, faced down Seymour. He had defended the engineering integrity of the line. And then, when the financial corruption that he had been protesting against finally caught up with the man he had protested against, he had quietly profited from it himself and quietly removed himself from the reckoning. Honesty requires saying this. Dodge was a remarkable engineer, a brave soldier, an effective intelligence officer, and a man of genuine personal courage in nearly every situation that called for it. He was also, in 1872 and 1873, a man who took the Crédit Mobilier money and refused to testify. Both things are true. Neither cancels the other. They are simply part of the picture of an actual human being who lived inside an actual American century. In 1898, Dodge was appointed by President William McKinley to head a commission investigating the conduct of the United States Army during the Spanish-American War. The commission traveled across the country in Dodge's personal railroad car, hearing testimony, inspecting hospitals and camps, reviewing the supply failures and the disease casualties that had plagued the American effort in Cuba. The final report, published as a Senate document, became known as the Dodge Commission. It was sharply critical of certain decisions, but ultimately exonerated the senior Army leadership. Dodge was, by then, in his late 60s. He had been a major general 33 years earlier. He had outlived almost every commander he had ever served under or alongside. He kept working. He served in 1907 as Commander-in-Chief of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion of the United States, a fraternal organization of Union officers and their descendants. He published his memoir, How We Built the Union Pacific Railway and Other Railway Papers and Addresses, in 1910, at the age of 79. The memoir is, as its critics have noted, not a model of modesty. Dodge gave himself substantial credit for things in which other men had played at least as large a role. The historian Walter Farnham, writing in the Journal of American History in 1965, would call several of Dodge's claims about the discovery of the Gangplank route fanciful. Stephen Ambrose, writing the popular history Nothing Like It in the World in 2000, took Dodge's memoir largely as truth. Professor John Larson, in his own work on Dodge, accepted the broad outline of Dodge's account, but added what he called a grain of salt, noting that the engineer had exaggerated his role in the actual construction of the line. The truth, as it usually does, lies somewhere in the middle. Dodge did not discover Sherman's Summit. Evans had been there first. Dodge did not lay the rails. Casement's brothers and an army of workers did. Dodge did not invent the Central Route. The Pacific Railroad surveys of the 1850s and Theodore Judah of the Central Pacific had been advocating versions of it for years. But Dodge did, in the final analysis, choose the path the Union Pacific took. He defended it against political and financial pressure. He held the engineering line. The men around him built the railroad. The man at the center of the photograph at Promontory had earned his place there. He had also, in his memoir, somewhat overstated the case. Theodore Roosevelt, who knew Dodge well, once said something to him that the engineer would treasure for the rest of his life. Roosevelt said in a public address, "I would rather have had your experience in the Civil War and have seen what you have seen and done than to be President of the United States." It was the kind of compliment that, coming from Roosevelt, was offered with full sincerity. Roosevelt, who romanticized the West and the frontier as much as any American of his era, saw in Dodge the kind of 19th century life that he himself would have liked to live. Dodge died at his home in Council Bluffs, Iowa, on January 3, 1916, at the age of 84. His wife, Ruth Ann, had preceded him in death by a few years. Their 3 daughters survived him. He was buried at Walnut Hill Cemetery in Council Bluffs. The grave marker uses the name Grenville Mellen. He had also been called Greenville and Grenville Mellen in various official records over the years. He had been one of the most consequential Americans of the second half of the 19th century, and almost no one outside the railroad and military history communities remembered his name 20 years after he was in the ground. The country, by then, had moved on to other engineers and other wars. The Union Pacific was a publicly traded company headquartered in Omaha. The Central Pacific had been absorbed by the Southern Pacific. The trans-American journey that had taken 6 months in 1849 and 7 days in 1869 could be made By 1916, in fewer than 4. The country had a network of more than 250,000 miles of railroad, a web that the surveyors of Dodge's generation had spun out across half a continent. The native nations that had been broken to make room for that web had been confined to reservations, their populations reduced to a fraction of what they had been a century earlier. The buffalo were almost gone. The open range was fenced. The frontier, in the official language of the United States Census Bureau, had been declared closed in 1890. Dodge's life had spanned almost exactly the period in which a continent had been re-engineered. The work was not subtle. The work was, in its way, the most important physical transformation of the North American continent since the retreat of the glaciers. To understand what Grenville Dodge actually built, we have to leave the engineer and the photograph for a moment and walk the line itself. The Transcontinental Railroad was not, in the deepest sense, a single thing. It was a corridor. It was a corridor that ran for nearly 1,900 miles across a continent that had been, 20 years before, almost entirely outside the working knowledge of the United States government. And it changed everything inside that corridor, almost immediately. Consider the buffalo. When the surveyors first moved up the Platte Valley in 1865 and 1866, the southern herd of the American bison still numbered in the millions. Travelers on the trail had reported herds so large that wagon trains could be held up for hours waiting for the animals to pass. The indigenous nations of the plains, the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche, the Kiowa, had built entire civilizations around the buffalo. The animal was meat, clothing, shelter, fuel, tools, ceremony. Take it away, and the civilization could not continue. The railroad took it away. It did not happen by accident, and it did not happen by some unintended consequence. The Army officers who oversaw the corridor, General Sheridan most famously, explicitly endorsed the destruction of the herds as a means of subduing the Plains nations. White hunters with high-powered rifles, financed by hide companies in the East, used the railroad to bring industrial-scale slaughter to the prairie. They shipped the hides east on the same trains that brought them out. By the early 1880s, the southern herd was effectively gone. The northern herd was destroyed in the same way a few years later. From an estimated 30 million bison at the beginning of the 19th century, the species was reduced to fewer than 1,000 individuals by 1890. The Plains nations, by then, had been confined to reservations. The two processes happened in lockstep, and both of them happened along the corridor that Dodge had laid out. Consider the hell-on-wheels towns. Cheyenne, the town Dodge himself had founded in July of 1867, would, in time, become a respectable state capital. But for its first year or two, it was something else. The historical record is full of accounts of Cheyenne in the late summer and fall of 1867. The Reverend William W. Bardwell, an Episcopal clergyman who passed through, wrote in his journal of streets full of mud, of saloons running 24 hours a day, of public hangings carried out by vigilance committees because there was no functioning legal authority, of gunfights at midday over disputes that nobody could later explain. The population, at its peak, may have approached 10,000 people. Most of them were transient. The men were the construction workers, the gamblers who followed them, the merchants who sold them tools and tobacco and bottled whiskey. The women, in disproportionate numbers, were prostitutes. The graveyard outside town filled up at a rate of several burials a week, many of them anonymous, many of them men whose names had never been recorded by anyone in town. When the railhead moved west in the spring of 1868, most of the population picked up their tents and followed it. Cheyenne survived because it had been chosen as a major railroad maintenance facility and a connection point to the Denver Pacific Line being built south. The other hell on wheels, Benton, Bear River City, the rest, did not. Benton, Wyoming, in the summer of 1868, was a particularly grim case. It had a population of perhaps 3,000 people. It existed for roughly 2 months. Its name appears on no modern map. There is a marker, somewhere in the high desert near Rawlins, indicating approximately where it stood. The graveyard, by some accounts, contained more than 100 bodies by the time the town was abandoned. The bodies, presumably, are still there. Consider the workers. The Union Pacific employed, at the peak of construction in 1868, more than 10,000 men along the line at any given time. The Central Pacific employed roughly the same number. They were not the same workforce. The Union Pacific's men were mostly veterans of the Civil War, Union and Confederate alike, working alongside each other on the Western Plains less than 3 years after they had been trying to kill each other in the eastern woods, along with Irish immigrants who had come to America in the great waves of the 1840s and 1850s. There were also freed black workers, particularly in the grading crews. They were paid in cash, when they were paid at all. The pay was decent by the standards of 19th century industrial labor. The work was lethal. Exact casualty figures from the Union Pacific construction were never compiled by the company. They have to be reconstructed from county death records, from cemetery rolls, from the diaries of contemporaries. The best estimates suggest that several hundred Union Pacific workers were killed in accidents, bridge collapses, runaway flat cars, premature explosions, falls, exposure, fever, fights. The exact number will never be known. The Central Pacific's workforce was, as we have seen, overwhelmingly Chinese. The Chinese workers received roughly the same pay as the white workers, but they worked the most dangerous jobs: the tunneling, the nitroglycerin, the snow camps. Their casualty rate was much higher. In the winter of 1866 to 67, Sierra avalanches swept entire work camps off the slopes. The bodies were sometimes recovered in the spring thaw. In some cases, they were sent back to China for burial. In many cases, they were buried in mass graves near the line and have never been identified. The Central Pacific kept no comprehensive records. Modern researchers, working from county death records, family genealogies in Guangdong, and oral history projects in California, have begun in recent decades to recover some of the names. The work is ongoing. Most of the names will never be recovered. Consider what the railroad enabled. In the first decade after the spike, the population of the western United States nearly doubled. The Homestead Act of 1862, which had been signed into law by Lincoln on roughly the same day as the Pacific Railway Act, had granted any American adult 160 acres of public land in exchange for a residency requirement and basic improvements. Until the railroad came, the Homestead Act was a promise without infrastructure. A homesteader in central Nebraska could not get his wheat to market. He could not bring in a stove or a plow without paying wagon freight rates that exceeded the value of the goods themselves. The railroad changed the math overnight. Suddenly, a farmer 200 miles from a railhead could ship his crop east and turn a profit. A rancher in Wyoming could fatten cattle on free grass and ship them on the hoof to the Chicago slaughterhouses. A mining concern in Nevada or Colorado could move ore in volume. The economic transformation was so total that one congressman of the era, surveying the post-railroad West, summed it up in a single dismissive sentence: "All that land wasn't worth 10 cents until the railroads came." It was a callous summary of a thing that had real cost, but it captured the financial reality. The land grants to the railroads, more than 130 million acres of federal land, had paid for the construction many times over. The government loans had been paid off by 1899. The land grants had been more than paid for, as one historian put it dryly, several times over. Consider also what the railroad ended. It ended the Long Trail emigration, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail, the great wagon roads that had carried perhaps 400,000 emigrants across the plains between 1840 and 1869 went almost immediately into disuse. A trip that had been the defining experience of a generation of American families became, after 1869, a tourist curiosity. The ruts of the wagon trains are still visible in places along the Platte Valley, but the trains themselves stopped within a few years of the spike. The economy of the trail towns, Independence, St. Joseph, Westport, collapsed. The new economy was the economy of the railroad towns. They were different towns. They served a different country. It ended the Pony Express, which had already been ended by the telegraph in 1861. It ended, more gradually, the long-haul stagecoach lines. It ended, almost completely, the riverboat economy of the upper Missouri River, which had been the main commercial artery of the northern plains since the days of the fur trade. And it ended, in a more profound way than any single battle or treaty had ended it, the era in which the indigenous nations of the plains and the mountains could meaningfully resist the United States. The Lakota would win one more famous victory after the railroad was built: the destruction of George Armstrong Custer's column at the Little Bighorn in June of 1876. It would be the last great Lakota military victory. Within months, the U.S. Army was concentrating force in the Powder River country at a scale that no indigenous coalition could match, and within a few years, the Lakota Nation had been compelled onto reservations. The Cheyenne and Arapaho had been broken earlier. The Comanche of the Southern Plains were broken in the Red River War of 1874 and 1875. The Apache of the Southwest held out longer in country the railroads could not easily penetrate, but by 1886, Geronimo had surrendered. The pattern was the same every time. The railroad came, the army came with it, the buffalo went. The nations were broken. Grenville Dodge did not personally do all of this. He laid out a railroad. But he understood more clearly than almost any of his contemporaries that the railroad and the conquest were the same thing. He had said as much, in slightly more genteel language, when he was commanding the Department of the Missouri in 1865 and ordering the Powder River expedition. The campaigns against the Plains tribes were, in their deepest logic, advance work for the railroad. The corridor had to be cleared. He had cleared it. His own memoir does not dwell on the human cost. It dwells on the engineering achievement, the political battles with Durant, the heroic decisions of Casement and the work crews. It is, in this sense, a typical document of its era. The men who built the Transcontinental Railroad did not, on the whole, think about the people they had displaced or destroyed. They thought about what they had built. They thought about the slope of the Gangplank and the height of the Dale Creek Bridge and the speed of the last day's track laying at Promontory. They thought about the spike. But the railroad they built was also a moral object. It bound the United States physically into one nation in a way no other single project of the 19th century did. It enabled the settlement of a vast country that had been, before the spike, almost empty by the standards of European agriculture. It made the United States, by some economic measures, the largest single market in the industrialized world by 1900. It did all of that, and it did it on the backs of laborers, many of them Chinese, many of them Irish, many of them black, many of them anonymous, who were not given the credit they deserved. It did all of that, And it did it on land that had been taken from people who had not, in any sense, recognized by the international law of the time or our own, consented to being moved off of it. The man at the center of the Russell photograph knew all of this. He knew it because he had been the commanding general of the planes. He knew it because he had given the orders, and he knew it because he was, above all, a man who looked at the ground in front of him and saw what was actually there. What was? There was a continent that had been remade. There is one more piece of this picture we should put in place before we close. It is the part of Dodge's life that does not appear in the photograph at Promontory, and that does not appear in the memoir, and that is not memorialized in any monument. It is the piece that the man kept for himself. He was, by all accounts, a devoted family man. The historical record on his private life is partial, but it is not silent. He had married Ruth Ann Brown of Peru, Illinois, on May 29, 1854, when she was 20 and he was 23. They had 3 daughters together, Letty, Ella, and Annie. The marriage lasted 61 years. During the long absences of the Civil War and the construction of the Union Pacific, Dodge wrote home constantly. The Library of Congress and several Iowa archives hold large collections of their correspondence. The letters are, by the standards of 19th century epistolary writing, not particularly literary. They are practical. They are warm. They describe what he was doing and what the weather was. They ask about the girls. They report on his health and ask about hers. They are, in their way, the document of a man who loved his wife and missed his daughters, and who would, when given the chance, come home. Council Bluffs was always home. He kept his bank in Council Bluffs. He kept his political base in Council Bluffs. The house he and Ruth Ann lived in there, a substantial Victorian mansion built in 1869, the year of the spike, on a high bluff overlooking the Missouri River and the Union Pacific Yards in Omaha across the water, still stands. It is now the Grenville M. Dodge House, a National Historic Landmark. From its front porch, on a clear day, you can see the bridge over the Missouri that is named in his honor. The Interstate 480 bridge between Council Bluffs and Omaha was officially designated the Grenville Dodge Memorial Bridge by the Iowa State Legislature, and the trains of the Union Pacific still cross the river within sight of the house. He chose the location for his retirement carefully. He had built a railroad. He wanted to be able to watch it from his porch. Ruth Ann Dodge had her own remarkable life and her own remarkable end. In the days before her death in 1916, she reported to her family 3 nights in a row of the same vivid dream, a vision of a figure standing in the prow of a boat beckoning her on. The dream affected her so deeply that she described it in detail. After her death, her daughters commissioned the sculptor Daniel Chester French, best known today as the man who sculpted the seated Abraham Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial, to render the figure from her dream in bronze. The resulting statue, known as the Black Angel, stands in Fairview Cemetery in Council Bluffs. It is one of the most striking pieces of American memorial sculpture from the early 20th century. It is the monument to Ruth Ann, not to Grenville. He survived her by a few months and was buried eventually with the rest of the family in Walnut Hills Cemetery. This is, in a sense, the human scale of the Dodge story. The continent-spanning railroad, the wife with her vision of the prow of a boat, the bronze angel, the bridge, the house with the porch, the man. Let us speak honestly about his contradictions. He was a New Englander by birth who became a Midwesterner by choice. He was a Republican by political affiliation, but a pragmatist by temperament. He was a soldier who was also an engineer who was also a politician who was also a financier who was also, at the end of his long life, an old man writing his memoir on a porch in Iowa. He served the federal government in the most consequential war in its history, and then helped to engineer the corporate political enterprise that, in many ways, defined the Gilded Age. He recruited black soldiers into the United States colored troops at substantial personal risk in 1863. He also commanded the campaigns that broke the Plains nations beginning in 1865, and he never apologized for those campaigns. He defended engineering integrity against Thomas Durant's corruption. He also bought Crédit Mobilier stock and made money from the very corruption he had opposed. He defied subpoenas to keep himself out of the congressional investigation. He befriended Grant and Sherman and Sheridan and Roosevelt. He outlived almost all of them. He was, in other words, a complicated American of a complicated century, and our story of him should not be flatter than he was. The historian Stanley P. Harshon, who wrote the most thorough biography of Dodge ever published, made the argument in 1967 that Dodge, by virtue of the range of his abilities and activities, could be considered more important in the national life after the Civil War than his more famous colleagues and friends, Grant, Sherman, and Sheridan. The argument is debatable, but it is not absurd. Grant was a soldier and then a president. Sherman was a soldier and then a memoirist. Sheridan was a soldier and then a soldier. Dodge was a soldier, a spymaster, a politician, an engineer, a railroad builder, an industrialist, an investigator, a memoirist, and the principal physical author of the largest construction project of his century. He touched almost every consequential corner of American public life between 1861 and 1916. He has been almost entirely forgotten by the general public. This is what survives of him in 2026. The Union Pacific Railroad still operates. It is one of the two largest railroads in the United States, headquartered in Omaha, Nebraska, in a tall building on Dodge Street. The original line that Dodge laid out, the rails over the Gangplank, the climb to Sherman Summit, the descent down Echo and Weber Canyons into Utah, is still in active use. Trains run over it every day. The original Sherman Summit was 8,242 feet above sea level. A 1901 line change shaved off about 200 feet of that, bringing it down to roughly 8,015, but the route is in nearly the same place Dodge put it. Interstate 80, the great east-west freeway across the country, follows the railroad almost exactly from Sacramento to Council Bluffs. The Lincoln Highway, the first transcontinental automobile route, dedicated in 1913, followed the same path. The Pony Express had used parts of it. The Transcontinental Telegraph had used parts of it. The wagon emigrants had used parts of it. The path is older than any of them. Dodge had simply made it a permanent piece of national infrastructure. The Dodge House in Council Bluffs is open for tours. The Black Angel still stands in Fairview Cemetery. Camp Dodge, the Iowa Army National Guard Center in Johnston, Iowa, is named after him. Dodge Hall at Norwich University is named after him. Fort Dodge in Kansas, an important post during the settlement of the Southern Plains, was named in his honor. Dodge City, Kansas, was named for the fort, which means that the most legendary cowtown of the American West takes its name, indirectly, from the man who routed the railroad that the cattle drives needed to reach the eastern markets. The Grenville M. Dodge Memorial Bridge still spans the Missouri. The Ames Monument, a 60-foot pyramid of granite blocks designed by Henry Hobson Richardson and built in the early 1880s to commemorate two of the principal Union Pacific financiers, the Ames brothers, still stands on the high plain near where Sherman Summit used to be. It is one of the great strange monuments of the American West, a pharaonic pyramid in the middle of a Wyoming sagebrush plain, marking a town that no longer exists, near a railroad summit that has been bypassed in honor of two financiers whose stock dealings nearly destroyed the company they were funding. Dodge would have understood it. He had spent his life building things in the middle of empty country. There is one more grave to mention. Somewhere in the cemeteries of the Powder River country and the Black Hills, somewhere in the unmarked burying grounds, along the Bozeman Trail, somewhere in the indigenous burial sites that the railroads and the homesteaders and the Army did not always respect, lie the bodies of the men, women, and children who paid the highest price for what the engineer had built. The Lakota call the highest land of the Black Hills Paha Sapa. It is still, by their understanding, sacred. The 1980 Supreme Court decision in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians acknowledged that the United States had taken the Black Hills in violation of treaty and awarded the Sioux Nation $106 million in compensation. The Sioux refused the money. They are still refusing it. The land was not, by their reckoning, available for purchase. The compensation with accumulated interest sits in a federal trust account today and has grown to well over $1 billion. The Sioux have made it clear they would prefer the land back. Both things are true at once. The railroad was built, and the land was not, in any final moral sense, paid for. This is, in the end, what we are talking about when we talk about Grenville Mellen Dodge. We are talking about a man whose individual life embodies an entire national history. He laid out a railroad, and the railroad transformed the country, and the transformation was both an extraordinary economic achievement and a moral debt that the United States has not finished paying. He was, in his person, almost a perfect representative of the great American 19th century. Its energy, its courage, its ingenuity, its violence, its dispossession, its capacity for self-deception, its capacity for accomplishment. He shook hands with Samuel Montague at the front of two locomotives at Promontory Summit on May 10, 1869, and the photographer caught the moment, and the moment has been used ever since as the official iconography of the binding of the United States. It is the right picture. The handshake is the right gesture. But there is a fuller picture, and we have been trying, in this hour and a half, to lay it out for you. He stood on the ridge in September of 1865 with a war party behind him, and he saw the slope of the land. He saw what could be built. He came down off the ridge. He built it. The work is not subtle. The work is the spine of a continent. If this story moved you, please leave a like so others can find it, and consider subscribing to Western Pioneer Archives for more long-form histories of the people, places, and choices that made the American West. Thank you for spending your time with us today.